This week we've seen absolutely rapidly changing circumstances around the world, particularly with the start of a conflict through the Middle East. And what we're noticing is that the Middle East, being one of the core hubs and arteries for aviation, is having really trickle-down impacts throughout the entire industry. The other thing it shows is that when geopolitics sneezes, aviation catches a bit of a cold. Welcome back to B73, guys. If you didn't see last week, I introduced this idea of rerouting aeroplanes through parts of the world that give favourable wind conditions. They might be seeking or avoiding jet streams to try and become more economical, have shorter flight times, be more sustainable, all these great things. But today, we're going to sort of take some of the pieces of that and apply it to rerouting for geopolitics when certain parts of airspace get shut down for reasons that are out of our control. And we'll introduce some of the subsequent challenges that we've faced as a consequence of this rerouting. So recently, just on the 28th of February, a couple of days ago, we saw conflict in the Middle East expanding where a total of 9 countries have now been sort of drawn into a conflict, mostly with Iran. Those countries include obviously Iran, UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, Iraq, Jordan, Syria, and Israel. Collectively, these countries represent around 3,400 flights a day that are now being cancelled. And Dubai alone, being the largest of those 9, represents around 2,000 flights a day that currently are not happening. This likely means that there's going to be significant overflow demand that's going to shift from those Middle Eastern flights that were either transiting, arriving, or departing from the Middle East to a lot of the other carriers around the world, particularly those based in Asia Pacific and Europe, that are going to have to somehow absorb this passenger demand that's no longer being fulfilled through the Middle East. The challenge with this is that this time of year particularly is a peak demand period for Asia to Europe flying, where load factors at the moment are sit around, on average, around 84%. That means 84% of the seats are usually full this time of year. And for the context of Middle East travellers, around 80% of those travellers had no intent to arrive and stay in the Middle East. They used it as a transit hub. So that means that 80% of passengers need to somehow be funneled out into other airways and operators that are flying around this region. This clearly points to a challenge for capacity, where you've got 80% of travellers on really quite substantial, large international carriers. If you look at Dubai, it's one of the biggest international departure ports in the world. And all these passengers are going to have to be somehow fit and squeezed into the 14% remaining capacity on other operators that are flying around the region. It's incredibly difficult to calculate what the impact of this is going to be in the short, medium, and long term. It's incredibly dynamic, it's unpredictable. But I think it's probably conservative to say that even closing down flights for a number of days, let alone weeks, will probably have weeks of compounding impacts, maybe even months, on the aviation market, particularly in that region. So we know there's a lot of departures and arrivals for that part of the world, but also something that we need to consider is the overflights. And just in the UAE, Qatar, and Iran FIR airspaces, that's the airspace that sits on top of those countries, represents around 1,000 to 1,500 flights a day that would normally fly through that airspace that is now closed. The Gulf Corridor, which is represented by those 9 countries that are now involved in the conflict that have closed or restricted airspaces, represents in total around 2,000 to 3,000 flights a day that would have overflown those countries. So those 2,000 to 3,000 flights that normally overfly the region, why don't they just fly around? And the answer is that they do, or they want to. It's just that there's limitations to airways. So think of airways like roads where they've got cars on them, and we can't obviously just stack ourselves on top of cars. There needs to be at least a little bit of separation between each vehicle. And of course in the sky it's 3-dimensional, so on one airway you could have airplanes stacked 1,000 foot apart in RVSM airspace, which is reduced vertical separation minimum airspace, which this region is. But stacking planes on top of each other isn't enough. It's not sufficient to get this volume of airplanes through those corridors for the amount of demand that exists. So to answer this question of flow limitation, about the restriction on how many planes can transit the routes to the north and south of the region, we need to understand about what types of rules do countries apply for minimum separation. And the document that is most relevant to this is ICAO Doc 444. It's got a PANS ATM chapter in it, which is basically procedures for air navigation services, and ATM representing air traffic management. So it's the chapter of basically a procedure manual that dictates the rule sets or the minimum separation that if you want to comply with ICAO, which is the International Civil Aviation Organization's recommendations, you have to follow this rule set. You can be more restrictive of that, and we'll talk about that in a moment, but generally these are the procedures for separating planes that everyone has to abide by in that airspace. Now, as I said, there can sometimes be deviations to ICAO Doc 444, but usually that'll entail certain additional requirements. And an example of this is at the base level, you require, depending on the airspace, so for instance in Turkish airspace, which is a common northerly route, to deviate around the Middle East conflict from Asia to Europe. And that would require 50 nautical miles or 10 minutes worth of separation if you're not complying with additional standards. Now, there's a thing called a LOAS, which is a letter of agreement. And under that document, it basically details that if you have additional equipment and you're under radar surveillance, which means that air traffic control can see you on their screen and with a high degree of accuracy say that that aeroplane is that dot on the screen, we can reduce that separation down to, in some scenarios, 5 nautical miles. That obviously is very good for separation, where otherwise you would have had around a 10-minute horizontal separation between two planes. Now you can decrease that down to, in some scenarios under radar surveillance, 5 nautical miles, which is really only about a minute's worth of separation. But with that, you've got a high degree of certainty. Air traffic control can see both planes, and that's why they're willing to accept that reduced horizontal separation. So that's a little bit of context about rerouting, the limitations for trying to funnel additional airplanes into a small number of remaining airways that go around areas of conflict and airspace closures. Obviously hoping this conflict is over as quickly as possible. It's not good really for anyone, particularly in aviation. If you happen to be traveling, safe travels, and I'll see you on the next video.